Okay. Um, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to the session on security and compliance. Before I get started, just quick reminder: if you guys are going to pass by at the back, just remember to duck down from the camera because this is getting live recorded as well. Um, okay. So my name is Don Pinto. I'm a principal product manager at Couchbase, responsible for the security area and many others. And again, I'm very delighted to be standing in front of you to talk about security. A quick slide on just a disclaimer slide because some of the stuff that we're going to be talking today is still in the works of, we've still been building a lot of these stuff because the product is in beta. There is also a bunch of roadmap stuff that I'm going to talk about today. Just a reminder that that is a plan based on some of the customer requirements that we have been hearing from all of you guys. So the need for data security requires no mention. Data security is all over the news nowadays, and you all know the importance of this very topic. And you all are here to learn about how you will keep your data secure with some of the features and capabilities that we have in Couchbase. So here is a quick rundown of the agenda that I want to talk about today. I thought I'll do something different and give you a quick refresher instead of going over all the security capabilities we have added to the product so far. So these are some of the capabilities we added in the past. But more importantly, focus on some of the core capabilities that you heard about this morning that we have added in 5.0 beta as well as 4.6. And finally, we'll leave some time at the end for the roadmap and the questions. So let's get started. So security is a major question at different levels. When we take a step back and look at a holistic point of view of security and how customers run Couchbase, this diagram is quite common. So what you see in this diagram is Couchbase is a critical piece of the database of the infrastructure and is typically deployed in an internal network behind multiple layers of firewall. So the data is as you see in the bottom, that is your critical data, sensitive data that needs to be protected. And on top of that, you have multiple layers of firewall, and you also have other pieces of the network, which is the perimeter network that has your application server and your web server. And on top of that, you have potentially another layer of firewall, and then you have your end users, which are accessing the app. So when you look at security at this level, there are controls or security features at different layers that you can employ to keep your data secure. So there are controls at the user, infrastructure, application, and data layer. Another way of looking at this is, what we call as the defense in depth approach, and this is again a common security paradigm. So what you look in this diagram, you're able to see multiple layers of security, data, admin, application, host, and then the other layers on top of that. And so what we're going to focus today in this session is the core bottom layers. So we're going to talk about access control and something to do with access control in your application. We're going to talk about how admins can manage accounts in the database. And finally, we're going to talk about a feature in encryption, what we added also called as secret management. So security has been an area where we have continuously invested for many, many releases in Couchbase, and we'll continue to do so. What this slide shows at a high level is the 5 pillars of security: authentication, authorization, crypto, auditing, and operations. And you'll see different features in each of these buckets. And what you see in green is basically the features that are new, net new in 4.6, such as PAM authentication, RBAC, which is new in 5.0, and then secret management that is new in 4.6. So let's go a level deep and understand each of these in detail. So the first thing I like to talk about today is authentication, right? So, and introduce what we call this concept called authentication domains. So in Couchbase, you might be familiar that you have this concept of the administrator. And if you already played with Couchbase, you'll realize that an admin account in Couchbase can be configured either locally, when you set up the software, or you can configure it in an external identity management system like LDAP. So that's exactly what we mean by authentication domains. We have the internal or local authentication domain, and we have the external authentication domain. And for the local authentication domain, what we added new, what we'll talk about and I'll also demo is internal management of users or the user management. From just completing the internal column, within the cluster, there is also authentication that happens between the nodes. And this happens through a shared Erlang token, which is exchanged between the nodes for the node-to-node authentication. And then we have the external authentication, which I mentioned briefly. And for that, we have integration with systems like LDAP and also support pluggable authentication modules of PAM, which I'll talk in the next slide about. So what is PAM at a high level, right? So PAM allows you, some of the use cases the PAM allows you to do is take your Unix local accounts and use those local Unix accounts to authenticate to Couchbase. So the PAM module also enables you, it's a pluggable architecture, so it enables you to also configure user policies and all the great stuff you can do around user management through PAM. So two things, right? From a business point of view, there are two things why PAM is useful. So first of all, it's centralized management because now you have your Unix users that you already manage, and then you can associate them with Couchbase using PAM. So it's kind of centralized in that aspect. And then there is security policy enforcement, which I talked about, where for each of the PAM users, you can set things like password complexity, rotation rules, and others. That is what is covered in this security policy enforcement part here. So that's a little bit of PAM. There is a bunch of more. I won't show you a demo of PAM today, but if you want to play with PAM and Couchbase, you should check out our documentation, and that was something that we added in 4.6 of the product. So let's switch gears a little bit. So the next high-level area that I like to talk about is authorization. So if you look from a persona perspective of who is using Couchbase, there are essentially two personas. There's the administrators who administer the system, and there is the applications or the services or the end users, developers who are playing with the system and developing apps on the system. So within these two personas, there's a feature that we added in the previous release of the product, which is role-based access control for administrators. And there is a net new feature that we have introduced in 5.0, which is authorization for applications or services. So let's quickly look at the administrator stuff, and then let's go into the more exciting stuff with applications. So if you again at a high level, the role-based access control for administrators offers you an ability to achieve regulatory compliance because now you can really segregate the duties of your different administrators through roles, and achieve privilege separation between, let's say, the full admin and the cluster admin for doing tasks such as security. And we'll see this in the next slide, right? So what essentially we added, again, in a previous release for RBAC for admins is basically a bunch of new admin roles. And these provide the separation of duties for administrator persona. So these are the full admin. So the full admin is pretty much an admin who has access to everything in the cluster. You can think of it as the god of the system. There is the cluster admin. And the difference between the cluster admin and full admin is subtle, but it's still important. The cluster admin can do everything the full admin can do except security settings. So if you have to add a user or remove a user or turn on auditing or disable auditing, that's something that only the full admin can do and not the cluster admin. And that gives you this nice segregation between the full admin and cluster admin, especially from a security point of view. There is also other granular admin roles, like we added the bucket admin, which is an administrator for just a particular bucket. You may be an admin just for the bucket foo, for example. Some of these roles are also parameterized, which allows you to use a wildcard parameter like star, so that let's say you come up with a bucket, let's say foobar tomorrow, you still want to be able that you future-proof your users to who are in these roles, so that they are admins of those new buckets that may come online later, and hence you can use a wildcard. So some of these roles you can say, you can target them to a particular bucket or use a wildcard, and so that is the case for bucket admin. And similarly, we have a view admin, which is an administrator that can configure views. And finally, we have XDCR admin. It's an admin account, admin role that can be used for managing XDCR or setting up the XDCR streams and the cluster references between two clusters. So one of the beauty of this system with our new work that we have done with 5.0 is in the previous release, all of these admins that you could associate with these roles required you to keep these users in LDAP. They required strict LDAP integration. And the last bullet, I think, it just closes that gap there, which is basically with the new user management interface that we've added with Couchbase, a new internal user management, you can now have internal users, which are then mapped into, can be mapped into these roles. So you may say, why is that important, or why is that not important? It's really useful for development and test environments, where you may not really in a dev and test environment want to tie your system with LDAP, but at the same time test the functionality and make sure that these roles really are working as they are, and that's why the internal users are really handy. Okay, so again, just part of the quick refresher here, we'll go into encryption. So when we look at encryption, there's two aspects of encryption. There's the on-the-wire encryption, and there is on-disk encryption. So on-the-wire encryption is typically you use a client and you have a server, and you want, let's say, TLS encryption between the client and the server. And that's something Couchbase provides that you can use. And we also provide, as I said, there is XDCR between two clusters. And you can use TLS to encrypt that pipe between these two clusters, which are across geographies. And finally, to have a much more trusted connection between the client and the server, we implemented X509 CA certificates for trusted encryption. So that's the CA certificate purpose here is the encryption between the client and the server. So that's a little bit on the wire encryption. Let's also look at on-disk encryption. So for on-disk encryption, our strategy has been to partner with our trusted third-party vendors, at least so far. So we have 3 of the vendors which are certified with Couchbase, and these are Warmetric, Protegrity, and SafeNet. And with these vendors, you can achieve both volume as well as application-level encryption. And these are typically the capabilities of most of the vendors in the space, where they would offer a more coarser grain volume level encryption, which is just encrypting blindly on disk, versus a more application level encryption where you can granularly encrypt a particular field in a JSON document and then store it in Couchbase. And most of the vendors we partnered with here that you see are leaders in the space, Gartner leaders in the space, and are also FIPS 142 compliant. Okay, so now that we have finished a refresher of what we had implemented in the previous release, let's look at the more exciting stuff that we've added in 5.0. And I'm very excited to introduce this new feature called role-based access control for applications. So what is role-based access control? What does it do? Why will it benefit you? So basically, you really need to meet regulatory compliance, and many of you may be needing to meet regulatory compliance for various different reasons, whether it's internal compliance within your own organizations, whether it's external compliance because you want to meet some standard. A lot of those compliance standards would would dictate a bunch of controls, and role-based access control for applications is normally one of them. And so that's why it's important. And what it enables you to do is just like you had segregation of admins when we did RBAC for admins, you can really now have segregation for your applications or services and your users. You can also lock down services as you're developing, let's say, different microservices for your app, like we're touching different services in Couchbase, whether it be a data service, a pure key value service, a nickel service, or a full text search service. You'll be able to lock down that service with the roles to only access that particular service endpoint and not touch other services. And we'll see that in a demo where we have these roles per service roles, and in which case you can use these roles to lock down a particular application to only talk to one particular service. So what is the model? So although we have built on the model that we already implemented in role-based access control for administrators, this new feature calls for us to revisit the model just because it is a huge change across the product. So I'll read the slide from bottom up. So we just go over the concepts very quickly. So we have introduced this concept in Couchbase called the user. And the user in Couchbase can be either a human user, like a developer who's just, let's say, querying the query workbench, or it could be a service. It could be an actual service or an application, a microservice that you've written to actually talk to the Couchbase cluster and maybe just talk to just the nickel service, let's say. You take a bunch of users and you can add these users into what we call as roles. And the RBAC security model as of 5.0 offers a bunch of fixed roles. We will go over the fixed roles of what we have introduced in the product. And these roles dictate what privileges this particular role has, or what privileges this particular user can have on a particular resource. And a resource can be a privilege is an action, and a resource could be any system resource. It could be a bucket, an index, and so on. Right? So this model is not new. You might have seen this model if you're coming from RDBMS world, you might have seen this model with other relational technologies. This is a standard NIST model. What we offer is the ability to add more user accounts. We have fixed roles out of the box. We can have one user mapped to more than one roles. And finally, the point I talked about, parameterization of roles, even that applies here. So you can really take one of these roles that we've introduced and say that it's only for a one particular bucket, or it's a wildcard and it's across all the buckets. And we'll see that in the demo shortly. So the next one is, I talked about user management a lot, and I wanted to show you, what really is, to summarize what really is the user management all about. So just quickly to summarize, we have added flexible user management, which means that you can now support internal as well as external authenticated users through domains. There are unique identities now for each of your data users. If you played with Couchbase earlier, you know that we had a bucket name and a bucket password, and now all of your services used to share that particular credential. Now it's not the case. You can really set up individual services to have different backend users in Couchbase. All of this that you see in the beautiful web UI here is all scriptable. So it's you can use REST or CLI to programmatically configure the users and set them up. Again, seamless upgrades. One of the thing is, given that we moved from a model which has bucket name and password to a model that has users, we wanted to make sure your applications continue to work without any downtime. So what we have added is we made sure that the upgrade path from the bucket user to the actual user now is really smooth. And finally, the system is scalable, so you can really configure hundreds or even thousands of backend users and use this user management system. Okay, so what are really the roles? So we talked about the users. Let's take a notch above and talk about the different roles that we have added. And let's talk about them one service at a time. So the first service I like to talk about is the data service. So in Couchbase, there are multiple services. There's the data service, there's a query service, there's the index service, and so forth. One of the roles we added here are the bunch of roles we added for the data service. So there is granular roles. For example, there is the data reader, which will allow you to only do read from a bucket. There's a data writer that can enable you only to do write on the bucket. There are a bunch of connectors, as we call it, which use the DCP protocol or the data change protocol. These are connectors which can use this specific role to just consume a DCP stream from a particular bucket. There are also tools like backup, which can now use dedicated roles like the data backup to do a backup operation if you're invoking backup, let's say, with a particular user context. And finally, there's data monitoring. This is regular stats in the bucket. It doesn't give you access to the data, just stats of full bucket stats, and you only want to get only to the bucket stats and nothing more. That's where you'll use the data monitoring role. So in the UI, you'll see a tree-like representation of this, and we'll see how we can add users to different roles in the demo. So that's a bit on the data service roles. Let's go and quickly look at the query service roles. So we wanted to keep the query roles very similar to the RDBMS world. So in the RDBMS world, you would, if you're familiar with something like grant select on table T1 to user U1, the select there is a privilege, and we wanted to be very close to that system, or be very in terms of syntax as well. So you would see that the roles we added are natural in that aspect. So we added the query select, the query update, the query insert, and so on. We also have very specific roles. For example, we have a role that can only allow you to do index management operations, which means that you have a user that can only do index management and nothing more and nothing less. And that's the role for query manage index. There is a query system catalog. Let's talk about a troubleshooting person who just wants to troubleshoot the catalogs, look at the runtime of statistics of queries, and then maybe also give them occasionally the query manage role. And you can also take it away from them once they're done the query management task, so they can really tune those nickel queries. That's something that you can also get out of the system. And finally, the query external access. This is a powerful role, but also you should use it with caution, because it enables you, we have introduced a new function in Nickel called curl, which enables you to integrate external data, let's say from an endpoint, and bring it to Couchbase to do the joins. In that case, you can assign, let's say a user into this role, when it's needed to do so, right? So these are the roles around queries that we've added, and we hope that this will meet majority of the use cases that we've seen. Finally, we'll talk about the full text search service. So this is something that Ravi announced in his keynote today. And if you look at the full text search service, we also did role-based access control for this service. And essentially, if you look at full text search, there's two real personas. There's the administrator, who can administer the full text search system. They can create the full text search indexes, do a bunch of other stuff. And there's a searcher who can really search the full text index. And that's the two roles that we've added for full text search. Now, although I showed you all the roles, remember that a user Dawn can be assigned to multiple of these roles. You can have Dawn having read on data. He can be a full text search searcher, and then he can also be a Nickel, let's say, updater, right? So you can add people. I just want you guys to realize that this gives you a lot of combinations, because now you can have add a user to multiple of these roles and achieve segregation that you require for your applications. So what if, I know this question comes a lot, right? I mean, a lot of you say, hey, this is all great. We added a lot of exciting roles, but you know what? I really like the interface you guys had earlier. Like, give me one role that gives me the access to all the bucket, just like you had the bucket password and you can do everything with that bucket. Can you still get that back because we changed the model? Of course you can. So we added a role called bucket full access. Exactly for that. It's useful for two things. It's useful to achieve the use case where you say, give me the old model where, give me a role that can give me everything just like the old model where you had the bucket password and you could do everything with that bucket. That's one of the use case. The second use case is upgrade. So while we upgrade your users from the bucket username and password to the new model, we will explicitly add that user into this bucket full access role. So then, that makes sure your applications seamlessly continue to work, and then you can go into the system and then tweak that application tweak the roles while you tweak your application on the side. Okay. So cool. So we looked at users, we looked at roles. What else can you do with local user management? So all of this is locally managed in Couchbase. So one of the questions we got asked a lot earlier is, okay, so can we do anything with the policy of these users? Now you're telling me that you can have a user, the user can have a password. What really can you do with this user, and can you control the policy? So with this release, we have offered what we call as a simple password policy scheme, where we have a bunch of different criteria, actually 5 of them. And we set the default password policy to make sure that your existing apps and existing buckets can migrate seamlessly. But once once the migration is done or you're happy with it, you can always go and tweak the password policy. And this password policy is not enforced immediately. It is enforced whenever you rotate a password or you set a new user. So you create a new user and you try to set a password, that's the time it gets enforced. We don't scan across your users and then enforce it. So that's a little bit on password policy, and all of this can be set through the REST and CLI. And there is also the ability to reset your password, and this can be done with the UI. So I'll show you that in a second. So the next thing is role assignment. So now you have users, you have roles. How can you assign users to roles? So of course you can do that in the UI. We'll go over a rich demo of showing you some of that. But just a quick reminder that all of this is CLI and REST scriptable. So you can have a REST command that really is able to take a user and add this user into, let's say, the data reader role over REST. You can do this also with CLI. You can basically use the CLI user manage command in the CLI and be able to accomplish exactly what you do. You want to put the users in particular roles. So I said we wanted to keep the system very similar in the relational world as well to RDBMS. So we also introduced in Nickel the grant and reward syntax. So very similar to what you see in other relational systems. So you have grant role, data reader, in this case to Dawn, and then also revoke role, data reader from Dawn. And that enables you to do grant and revokes also through Nickel. We also added new system tables. So a lot of people want to know, hey, what role am I in? What are the applicable roles in the system? So we added two new catalog tables. They're called applicable roles, which gives you a user to role mapping just at a high level. And then you have full user info, because you have the domain type of the user or the authentication domain. You have all the bunch of other attributes, of course, not the password that we show. And that's something that we have in the user info table, the catalog table that you can query to get the full, a more detailed understanding of all your user accounts. And finally, I think you guys are all waiting for this, right? I mean, the query workbench or the web console was only accessible through the admin username and password. And with 5.0, that has changed. The fact that we have brought in users to the system now enables you to go in as that user and access the query workbench, and that's really powerful, because now your developers don't really have to give your admin passwords to the developers who are using the query workbench. You really give them their user credentials, and they can really go and access the system, and they only see what they have to see and nothing more. So with that, I think it's more fun time. I'll show you guys a demo of some of this, and hopefully this is exciting. So let me switch. Okay. So let me. Okay. So this is the new admin UI. I'm going to log out. This is a new, fresh look of the admin UI. I set this cluster up with administrator and a password. And I don't have a workload running, but I want to show you demo the essential user management pieces that we talked about, and also show you some of, with a simple app, show you what you can do with how you can really achieve this segregation. So there is, note that I've logged as full admin, so I see this tab called security, And remember, as I said, only the full admin can see the security tab. So if you go here, you'll see that we don't have any users in the system. This is a simple node. It's a one node, just a one node installation on my Mac machine. And let me just go there. So the first thing I want to show you is how we can use REST for creating a user. So I'm going to pull up my terminal here, and I'm going to try this. So you'll see that I created via REST a simple user called daunting, and I gave it a password over REST. If you look at the REST command, the real password here is password, just to keep it distinct than the admin password. There are a bunch of mandatory and optional attributes. The username is definitely mandatory. The role string is mandatory, and you can look at the auth domain. In this case, it says Couchbase, which is basically a locally managed user. If you would use this command, let's say on a Linux machine, you could set up an external managed user also through LDAP, right? There's a bunch of things you can do here as a user. You can delete the user as an admin. You can delete the user account. You can reset the password. Also, you can edit the user account, right? So this is, it's just a simple data reader example on travel sample. So note that I created already a travel sample bucket here. So that's the reason I can associate this user with the travel sample bucket. Now, let me go to the script again and show you how we can do this over CLI. So this is the same command, similar command executed over CLI. I'm in my bin folder, where I have the CLI utility installed. And if I do this, give me a second. You'll see that this CLI command is basically a user managed command. I say that this username is daunting user. So let's look at it here. It's easy to read it here. So I created two users. This is for the data service. This is having data reader. And then I have daunting user, which is a query select role on star, which means I can run a select statement on all the buckets, including travel sample. Let me create two more users. So I showed you how to create this with REST. I showed you how to create this with CLI. Let me show you the graphical way to create this. So let's create a user called FTS searcher. I'm going to skip the full name here, assign it some password. And this is the tree-like structure that we've introduced. So if you expand the FTS roles, and this is an FTS searcher role, I can really go and say I want an FTS searcher only on the travel sample bucket. Similarly, I'm going to create another role. Let's call this FTS admin. And so net I have 4 users here. You can definitely create more users, but for the sake of demo, I'll just show you starting with these 4 users. So what I'm going to do now is I'm really going to show you an app example where so I have built a simple Node.js app, and let me restart this Node.js app. So this Node.js app, before I do that, let me just so if you look at this Node.js app, it's listening on port 3000. It connects to the backend cluster with daunting user, the user we just created, and it authenticates with password. It connects and tries to open the travel sample bucket, so it should be able to use. And then it has a bunch of endpoints. So if you post to the endpoints, it's going to do some certain action. So for example, I just want to walk you through this. This is an airline endpoint. You can, if you post to that endpoint, it will try to basically insert a document inside the system, right? So very simple app, just as a proof of concept here. So this is an app listening on port 3000. I'm going to just show you, I'm using Postman here to basically run this query. So you can see that I'm going to post to this endpoint. It's an airline endpoint. The body I'm going to send is, Let me change this. So let me change this for a second. So I'm going to change the call sign to Spider Airways 2, and I'm going to set this as 54321 as the ID. The headers are just content type because the application knows how it has to authenticate to the backend. So let me send this. So as we expected, maybe not the real error we expected, but remember guys, we're still in beta. So the application was supposed to do a write in Couchbase, but the error code, basically we get an error code. It is cryptic at this point, but we will improve it. It's not able to, if you look at the details, it's not basically able to write to the bucket because it's not authenticated. It's not authorized to write to the bucket, because if you go and look up the roles, Dawn data user only had the data reader role and not the data writer role. So let's go and change that, right? So let's go and let's see if we can use a query to do that. Let's see. So let me try this one. So what I did here is I showed you the nickel example of grant, and I granted the data writer role to the bucket travel sample to user Dawn data user. So let's go back and check that. So you see Dawn data user now has the data writer and the data reader, which is great. So let's go back to our app and then execute that. So you'll see that succeeded. And you see that the app is also coded in such a way that it reads that document back from Couchbase, and you see that it has successfully set. But we'll go and make sure that we can really do that, and it is the case. So what I'll do here is I'm going to copy over the ID. I'm going to log out as admin, and I'm going to show you what we can do now with Dawn nickel user. So remember, as I said, this is cool for the new 5.0 release, because you could have users to log into the UI, not like before where you had admin. So you really see that we have Dawn nickel user, which has logged into the admin UI. And if you look at query, what I'm going to do here is, of course, I can try to execute grant, and you will say, hey, you can't really execute grant statements because you're just a query, you just have query select permissions. So what I'm really going to do here is I'm going to run let's hopefully run the, try to run this. And you'll see that this user was able to select back this document that we just set. But let's try to do something more interesting. Let's try to insert something into this. So let me go back to my, and you'll see that this user is not able to insert. It's able to select, but it's not able to insert. And that's exactly what the roles dictated. The role said you could only do a select on this bucket and not do an insert on this bucket. And so that's our expected result. So that's a demo of the nickel service, of how you can isolate a nickel service to do specific nickel operations, and also the data service. I showed you how to do that. Finally, let's look quickly at the full text search service. So I'm going to log out. I'm going to log in as a full text search admin. Yeah. So you can choose to assign. So the question was, if I have a user with data reader role, and I assign data backup role to that user. Of course, so we don't do checking. We don't check whether the assignment is incorrect. What we do is the net effect of this, when you add more roles, or user into multiple roles, the net effect is a combination of the permissions privilege of both the roles. So to answer your question, a user Dawn who's assigned data reader on foo and backup also on foo will be able to do the full backup, read, write, just how the backup. Two things. So you'll be able to do data read on the bucket through the app that I just showed. Plus, you'll be able to execute the backup utility for the bucket using the user Dawn. No, so there's no context switching. So basically the net. When the connection goes in, the net effect of the connection, the net permissions of the connection is a union of the permissions of both the roles. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Yeah. So you can, so that's the reason you may want to create a new user and then segregate that way, or yeah. 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 Okay. So let me. I know we're running out of time here, so let me try to do this really quickly. So you see that here we have I've logged in as a full text search admin, FTS admin, and so what I created is, there is an index already existing. So one thing I wanted to show you here is I pre-created a full text search index, and you can see that the full text search admin has the ability to add indexes, drop indexes, remove indexes, all of that. So that's what you get with the full text search admin. So let me just log out and just show you the final part of the demo is an FTS user, right? And then and so I logged in as an FTS searcher, and if you look at this, what I'm trying to do here is I can't do anything with the index because I'm not an admin. But if I click on that, I can really search. So if I say, spider 2, for example, or whatever, right? Let me see. Let me search the word in, for example, just across the documents. Okay, there's probably nothing here, but essentially you would be able to run this this search query and be able to return results if there is a match and show the results here. So that's exactly what you would get with FTS Searcher. And that concludes my demo. So in reality, what I showed you today is you can get service isolation, you can create the users and map them to different roles to achieve that segregation, and hopefully that will meet your use cases. So I'm going to switch back very quickly to the slides, and just a quick time check. Are we out of time or 5 minutes? Okay. I'll just briefly mention what we have done in secret management very quickly here. So with 4.6, what we enable you to do is we have a lot of system secrets that the system stores, such as passwords, as you saw, other system secrets, cookies, and so forth. And what this improvement enables you to do is store these secrets in Couchbase metadata in an encrypted fashion. This secret management system can be driven by a user-specified password. So when the system bootstraps, you can either set this, send Couchbase this password either through an environment variable or in command line. And we basically, we have an encryption hierarchy here, which basically takes that password, cracks open a data key, and then uses that key for encryption or decryption and vice versa. So it's a completely zero knowledge secret management system. Basically, it's completely driven by the user password. And you can really tie this with your hardware security module. As long as you can use some agent in the module to set that environment variable, it's perfect for bootstrapping your system. So very quickly, I want to close with the roadmap and compliance, right? So we have a couple of slides on that. So here is our roadmap at a glance. So there's today we showed you, we talked to a couple of features that we've introduced, but the work is not over. There's a couple of work items we have on the short term, medium term, long term, and based on the inputs that we've been receiving from all our customers, we are aggressively prioritizing this roadmap. And so what you see on the short term is features such as certificate authentication, where you can authenticate with a certificate. Basic data auditing, which the reason the certificate authentication is in green is we've already started some work, so we might surprise you, let's say with 5.0 GA, who knows. There is the medium term, and then there is the long term list of items. So that's kind of the roadmap at a glance. And again, reminder, this is just a plan based on what we have been learning from the field and customers so far. And finally, a lot of people ask me this question, like, how are we doing compared to PCI, right? And so this is a quick slide that shows you some of the PCI controls and where are we, in terms of meeting those controls with Couchbase. So you'll see a lot of these areas which are green lighted. Some of them can be accomplished through compensating controls, where you can have, let's say, third-party vendors such as Warmetric and other technologies to encrypt your data in Couchbase and achieve or green light a couple of these. And there are some of them where we have gaps, and as you saw in our roadmap, we are kind of working tirelessly to basically go and fill those gaps. Finally, just a quick reminder, beta is out. We want your feedback. This is exciting time for us. We have the couchbase.com/download. This is where you go and get the beta and get running with it. Give us your feedback. And again, thank you to everyone for coming here today, and hope this was useful.